This episode of Over a Barrel is brought to you by, when you make the call, Valero's there to answer with 24/7 US-based customer support. Because we believe you should always have the fuel you need when you need it, right now. Coming up on Over a Barrel, it looks a little bit different on your screen right now. We have a special guest, and it is actually the spokesperson for the Port of Tampa. A lot of stuff going on after Helen as well as Milton. We've got that special guest coming up right here on Over a Barrel. Well, welcome to the program. I'm Matt McLean. Somewhere in the middle here is Patrick DeHaan, and then we have a special guest on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. Hello to everyone.
Hello.
Well, good to be back with you, Matt, and Lisa. Thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it. This is going to be a terrific episode for those that really like the information on the cusp of when it's happening. It's a real treat to have you, Lisa.
Well, thank you so much for having us.
Absolutely. That is Lisa Wolf-Chasen. She is a spokesperson for the Port of Tampa, and we know that so much has been going on across a good percentage of Florida, back-to-back hurricanes, just a crazy time across the region. And so many folks, if you haven't lived in Florida, or you probably know somebody that does, or you visited for vacation, whatever the case may be, you certainly have that personal connection to Florida. And the area is still recovering by far. So we wanted to invite Lisa on. We thank her for joining us and all of that, and kind of break down some of the stuff that has taken place at the Port of Tampa, why it's so important over the coming minutes. And as you can see, Patrick kind of scrolling through. For those of you listening, we also do a video version of this podcast as well, and you can view that on YouTube and other aspects within the GasBuddy arsenal of channels, if you will. And so, Lisa, first of all, talk to us a little bit about the port itself, and really, for folks who don't realize how important the port is, especially when it comes to fuel delivery. The port obviously does a whole lot more than that. There are cruise ships. There's everything at the port, right? But for the most, all intents and purposes here right now, fuel delivery has been the big one. So talk to us about how important the port is in the state.
Absolutely. Port Tampa Bay is actually Florida's largest and most cargo diverse port. We are the largest by land. We have about 5,000 acres within our operations. And a lot of people in the Tampa Bay region know us most because it's the most visual as they pass by on the major interstates for our cruise line of business. But cruise is just about 20% of our overall revenue. We are considered an energy gateway port, which means that we are a major fuel supplier for the state. About 43 to 45% of the entire state of Florida's fuel flows through Port Tampa Bay. And that includes not only the gas for your cars, but jet fuel as well for Tampa International Airport and Orlando International Airport, as well as some smaller facilities.
Boy, it's I knew it was important. I didn't realize it was approaching 43 to 45%. That is a very large number. So when a little bit of a hiccup in weather takes place, that can really have a very big ripple effect, I would think, across portions of the central part and southwestern portion of the state.
Absolutely. So every time we see severe weather, especially our hurricanes, we prioritize what we call the 3 Ps as soon as we can once the shipping lanes of our port get reopened. And that's petroleum, people, and perishables. So we want to bring any cruise guests back. We want to bring, obviously, those groceries that people need. But also in that mix, just as important, if not more so, is petroleum, because we know people need that fuel for their generators, for their vehicles if they've had to evacuate. And so we prioritize getting those vessels back in when a storm follows. But in preparation for a storm, we drill with our fuel terminal operators who operate privately of our port as a landlord operation. We make sure all of their safety measures are up to date and comprehensive. And we also allow our fuel tankers who visit our port via trucks to come in until it is not safe to do so. So even as the Coast Guard is closing down our shipping channels in advance of a storm, we're letting those fuel trucks get supply into their vessel or to their vehicles to take out to the region. And so we did that with this storm. We did that with Hurricane Helene that unfortunately hit us just 2 weeks ago. And what that does is allows those fuel trucks to be positioned in areas of need so that as soon as the storm passes through, they can start distributing out that fuel to individual gas stations.
You know, the last time that the Tampa Bay region was had a direct hit was 103 years ago in 1921. Very familiar, not because I was alive back then, but because I used to anchor news down there, obviously, and I'm very familiar with the even where it hit land there in Tarpon Springs in 1921. So, understandably, everyone is always taught to have a hurricane kit. Everyone. I would assume that would include the Port of Tampa, your own version of that. In other words, preparations. So you had back-to-back hurricanes. How much damage did the port have in either or both scenarios?
We were really lucky, and I think part of that it's partly luck and part planning. So we do a hurricane exercise with state, local, federal partners, as well as our maritime community every single year. It's something our president and CEO, Paul Anderson, started when he came aboard as our port director. And what that allows us to do is open the communication pathways to share resources, best practices, practice worst case scenarios, and that really helped us prepare for these set of storms. The damage for Helene was more focused on the storm surge. So we had areas of our port that had flooded, and thankfully, all of our berths and wharfs, those didn't sustain major damage. So we were able to get back online pretty quickly after that storm, even with the flooding concerns that we dealt with. With this storm, we had prepared for, again, severe storm surge. We were expecting to get 10 to 15 feet of storm surge with this storm. Because it ended up a little further south than originally predicted, we kind of lucked out. We were on the northern side of that storm. So while we saw higher winds with this particular storm, Hurricane Milton, we didn't have to deal with the back-to-back flood scenarios, which I think would have kept us offline much longer. So that was actually a really great, that's it can't be described by anything but luck. We can't control Mother Nature. We can control everything else, but because we didn't have to deal with that storm surge, we really focused on getting power back to our port, and especially those fuel terminal operators and other areas that we knew were going to be critical in the storm recovery response. But again, our roadways were able to be cleared pretty quickly. We did have minor damage throughout our port and some power issues throughout our port, but our wharfs, our docks, our roadways, most of the major infrastructure components were, they fared pretty well with both storms.
Well, that is fantastic to learn, and I'm very glad to hear that. How, as far as from the time of the taping of this particular podcast, where do things stand with the port as far as its operational status right now?
We are fully open and operational. So we were able to reopen our shipping lanes this past weekend. And starting on Saturday, throughout the day, we started to have those fuel trucks come back and start to be able to refuel. Again, even with our shipping lanes being closed, we can start to reopen our landside operations. Our priority after Milton moved through was to get power back to our fuel terminal operators. So we worked with the local electric provider, which is TECO or Tampa Electric, to make sure that the fuel terminals were prioritized. We ensured that we had open communication with the governor's office, as well as our local delegation, our state and federal delegation, to bring in any resources that we might have ended up needing. We were talking with FEMA very closely. Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg was in contact with our port just to make sure that we had the resources that we needed to be able to reopen as quickly as possible. Thankfully, we didn't end up needing FEMA to send down generators, but that was in discussion. We were really looking at all avenues to get fuel flowing as quickly as possible. On Friday night, some of those fuel terminals started to come back online, and we had the fuel trucks start to trickle in. And then by Saturday, it was kind of gangbusters. You just saw hundreds and hundreds of fuel trucks starting to visit our port. So since Friday, mid-afternoon, evening, when the process really began, we now have had more than 2,000 fuel trucks, actually closer to 2,500 fuel trucks come and refuel to send out into the community. And we've had 7 separate shipping vessels come. So fuel vessels come, and we have more just waiting right outside of our channel. So as soon as one discharges and is able to leave, we have another one scheduled to come right behind it. So fuel supply actually in Tampa Bay has never been an issue with this storm. Again, we prepared knowing the storm was coming, both for Helene and Milton. We never saw a dip in our fuel supply. The problem was after Milton, making sure we could get our fuel terminals back online so it could be discharged out to the community.
Yeah, and we want to stress, for those of you watching and listening right now, what Lisa's talking about specifically is the Port of Tampa itself. We know that there are some gas stations that are still waiting to get their fuel shipments, and that's just part of the process when something like this takes place, because a lot of evacuations had to take place. People had to have fuel to get out of harm's way, and then there's the cleanup, and there's all this other aspects, and it requires an awful lot of fuel. So I'm very thankful to hear that the port itself sustained such minimal damage, because we talked about this last week, I believe.
Yep.
I was deeply concerned, because I knew how important the Port of Tampa happens to be to this day, and it was such a monstrous storm that.
And last week we were looking at a
concerning.
direct impact, and then at kind of the last moment, Milton stayed a little bit further to the south towards Sarasota, which probably spared us from seeing some of that potential storm surge. So certainly, and by the way, some interesting numbers. Lisa had mentioned about 2,500 fuel trucks. For those that don't know, kind of an average truck might carry about 8,000 gallons. So those fuel trucks represent almost 20 million gallons of gasoline. And interestingly enough, Matt, when some of the outages, when stations were trying to pull product, they were actually having to go to other areas like even Jacksonville and southeastern Florida to pull product desperately. I mean, looking at the graphic here for those on YouTube, this is the percentage of stations in Florida that were without gasoline at one point on the 11th, which was last Friday, peaked at about 26%. Thankfully, it's plummeted since then. And even today, it's been plummeting down to 16.5%. And to Lisa's point, now the port's been kind of fully operational. The numbers should come down. And a lot of Floridians are also sitting on mostly full tanks of gasoline. So that certainly helps as well.
And then,
absolutely. And I was just going to add, these fuel trucks that are coming and visiting our port ever since Friday afternoon, evening, when the fuel terminals started to come online, they've been doing that 24 hours a day. So they know that this is a huge priority. And even if they wouldn't normally operate around the clock, they are doing so now, because we want to see those numbers, as you mentioned, come down. I mean, we live, work, and play in this community too. So we're, as port employees, impacted by all of this. And we know that our role in storm recovery is so important, and we want to help our community the best way we can.
And Patrick, I was going to ask you, the previous chart there with the percentage of gas stations that currently were without fuel, that was a statewide average, or that was a Tampa Bay average, or what was it that you had pulled up?
What I had pulled up was a statewide average,
okay.
And I'll quickly revert to that. So at one point, the state had over 25% of stations without gasoline. In the Tampa area, Sarasota, St. Pete, Clearwater, Tampa, there were some moments where it was definitely over 0.75% and where most people couldn't find fuel. And keep in mind, the way the GasBuddy tracker works is if we don't have an update since the storm started, I mean, if you had a station, arguably every station had gasoline in the week ahead of the storm. If GasBuddy doesn't get an update, we can't expect that the stations run out of gas. So that's why in some instances you may have seen GasBuddy reporting a station that had gas that didn't end up having it, is because nobody reported it to us as running out or having a canopy that collapsed. So that's kind of the challenge with some of this crowdsourced data, is that if you don't have anyone updating it, we simply don't know how quite bad the problem can be. So I know a few folks have been running into that. Interestingly enough, Lisa has mentioned some of the ships that have come into the port. To give some backdrop on this, there are some laws that do apply to this, and some of these tankers that go into Florida generally have to be U.S. flagged carriers. That's something that pertains to what we call the Jones Act. So these refineries have to use specific carriers. Interestingly enough, Golden State is one of those tankers that had come into the port just recently. It can carry about 331,000 barrels of gasoline or diesel or other products. That's about 13.9 million gallons. which if you're a fuel truck, that's about 1,700 fuel trucks, Matt, of gasoline supply. So just to throw some context out there. And I think, Lisa, I don't know if you can provide exact specifics on how many of these tankers have been coming or going or are scheduled, but I believe there's a few more due.
Yes, absolutely. In typical times, we have about 2,000 trucks in a 24-hour period. So, as I mentioned, since Friday and really Saturday is when things really got back to normal with in regards to our fuel terminal operators. Since that point in time, we've had about 2,500, and the number grows day by day. So on Friday, it might have just been a few hundred, and then the next day it increases, and we expect for that trend to continue. So we are seeing, like I said, just increased activity till we get back to normal. And as I mentioned previously, as these vessels come and discharge their fuel here at our port, they go back out. And as soon as they're out, we have another fuel vessel waiting to come in. So it's not as if, okay, we're going to see a momentary spike and then we could have a panic again. No, there's going to be a constant fuel supply coming in. And really, Tampa Bay never had an issue of supply being close by as far as the fuel was ready to deploy into the region. The problem was just without the other steps of the supply chain being able to be operational because of either power outages or road closures or blockages. Well, then that fuel can't get to the people who need it. Now that system is starting to open back up. We are just one part of that supply chain, but a very important and critical part. And so now you'll start to see that trickle down effect where it should be impacting neighborhood gas stations soon. I know anecdotally, I live in Pinellas, I work in Hillsborough, so I have to commute, so I need gas. And whereas I saw the long lines that everyone saw on the news, and I'm sure saw in your app, now they're getting shorter. I have been able to get gas today I waited for one car in front of me, and that's just because I went right at lunchtime. I think if I had gone later in the day, there'd be no wait at all. So just anecdotally, I know it's improving. And then by the numbers, we know that we're getting much more fuel out of our port and into our community.
Don't touch that device. We've got more Over a Barrel coming up right after our sponsor, Valero.
All across America, you'll find Valero at your go-to gas station, volunteering with local charities and fueling communities 365 days a year, so you can always get where you need to be, right now.
And now for the rest of Over a Barrel. A lot of folks may not realize, the actual bay itself, Tampa Bay proper itself, is the average depth is only about 12 feet. But you have shipping channels, obviously, which are dredged to a much deeper depth to be able to facilitate, exactly like the photos that Patrick was just showing of some of these large ships that have to make their way in, and the cruise ships as well. And there's a lot of coordination with that, with the port as well, because as you mentioned, there's cruise ships that have to come in and depart and all of these other things. So you all are very busy right now, no doubt whatsoever.
Yes, year round, we have both a port heavy weather advisory group, which includes individual port tenants, port leadership. It includes the Tampa Harbor pilots. Again, you mentioned the Jones Act, Patrick. That also requires U.S. Vessels or vessels that are visiting U.S. ports to have a local harbor pilot to steer in those local waters for safety. We have to make sure that they can operate safely. We have to operate with the Coast Guard. They have to survey the channels, making sure there's no blockages and our navigable shipping channels that are 43 feet deep. So if you have any debris or shoaling that impacts those, then that takes time. Thankfully, we didn't have any major blockages on our shipping channels. We had some buoys that kind of got knocked out of position, but again, it was almost nice practice with Helen. Obviously, we never want to see back-to-back hurricanes again, but because we had just gone through this whole process, we knew exactly what to do, which resources to call on. Everyone worked together seamlessly. And we also have a vessel movement committee, and they've also worked to prioritize those 3 Ps I mentioned earlier, the petroleum, perishables, people, make sure that we had the vessels that absolutely needed to get back into our port, getting back in first, being first in line, and pushing some of those other cargo operations, because we are a very diverse port here. We handle pretty much every cargo type imaginable, but making sure we're shuffling accordingly to make sure that what the community needs is what it's getting first.
Including orange juice, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I did see a juice hauler the other day. I had a question for Lisa. When it comes to kind of these storm situations, Helene, in Milton. Could you give us a little bit of the kind of the timeline of, who's in control, who decides that the port needs to be put on alert, who shuts it down, who decides to reopen it, what happens in between, so that our users can be a little bit more thoughtful when we're running through this process?
It all is ultimately decided by the U.S. Coast Guard. However, I mentioned we have a port heavy weather advisory group, and that consists of private terminal operators, our port tenants, our port leadership, the Tampa Bay harbor pilots, and the Coast Guard sits on that committee. And they will work together to determine what's safely feasible and make a recommendation to the Coast Guard. They also, we work very closely with the National Weather Service. They give us the best data that they have available as soon as they have it. We have a local point of contact that also is very active in this group. But ultimately, it is up to the Coast Guard to determine when it's safe to open the port and when it needs to be shut down in advance of a storm.
As far as the restarting of the port, if you will, reopening of the port, I know that every storm is unique. Every situation is unique. Do you think that there will be some things that you have learned with back-to-back storms that you'll be able to implement and do even more efficiently? Heaven forbid there's another storm anytime soon, but undoubtedly something will happen that you'll need to be prepared for. Do you think there are lessons to be learned from all of this?
Absolutely, there always are. So I mentioned we do that annual hurricane exercise. That always provides us a good touch point to reconnect with people, because I think when you have open lines of communication, everything gets tackled a little more smoothly. But in addition to that, we always schedule a hot wash with key partners and law enforcement and NOAA, National Weather Service, Coast Guard. We invite all of them to take part. We were actually supposed to have a hot wash for Helen, and we had to reschedule it because Milton was approaching. But we will have a hot wash to discuss these storms individually as well as overall, so we can share best practices, things, lessons learned, and we're constantly making improvements. I mentioned also we're very fortunate that we have a lot of really dedicated port partners that are our tenants and our terminal operators that conduct their private and independent safety drills. And we get invited to sit in on those, which is also very helpful. So that helps us understand, hey, if we didn't have a fuel spill in this storm, but if we did, this is who we'd be talking to. This is who we need to connect with. This is how we'd work collaboratively. This is whose role's what. And so that's constantly being talked about, not just as a storm comes and goes, throughout the year. And we're really proud of our commitment to the hurricane exercise. We host a safety summit to talk about other aspects of port safety every year. And again, we just keep engaged with our port tenants. We're actually the first port in the country to be certified as storm ready by the National Weather Service. So we really take pride in our preparation. And I think that's why we were able to get the port back open in less than 20 or 48 hours after this storm moved through. Maybe not to the full degree, but we're looking at forward progress because everything that we can do helps the community. And just like the community and privately and personally, all of us are dealing with this. You got to take one step at a time, put a foot in front of the other, and just, you can't expect to return to normalcy, immediately after a storm, but working towards it is what we're constantly going to be doing.
Yeah,
I think you just brought up a very good point with regard to that the personal aspects of everyone that works at the port, they have to go through all of that as well. Working in the news media there, I have a very full understanding of that, because even though it was our job to keep everyone informed of what was happening in a hurricane, well, your own family and yourself, you have to deal with the aftermath just like everyone else. And, that takes its toll on responders and people who work in the port and other aspects as well. That those are the things that a lot of folks may not fully realize and understand. Yep, we're all still here. Are you there?
I'm so sorry. I froze for a moment.
But she's back with us, I hope. So
I'm so sorry about that. I just froze briefly. Sorry.
It's all good. It's all good. No,
Matt, I was looking up earlier. Lisa mentioned, there's still additional cargoes waiting out here, and if we look on, there's a lot of these websites. This one, marinetraffic.com, you can see 3 additional oil chemical tankers that are still waiting to call port. So there's a lot of fuel here. These numbers should continue to decline here. Florida is now below 20%. I think it was actually below 15% outage. So there's a lot of good movement here. And I think hopefully by the weekend, it's not going to be the migraine to find fuel in Tampa that it was just a couple of days ago.
That's the hope, understandably. And I know that it's been frustrating for those of you who may be watching across Southwest Florida, Central Florida, and listening. It can get frustrating in those situations. We all know that. And for any of us who have lived in a hurricane alley, we empathize, understand firsthand exactly what all of that's like, the hurricane kits, everything. But at least know that, if you've been out of touch with humanity for a while because you haven't had power, and maybe you just got power back on, or your internet or your phone service because cell phone service was also impacted, and you're just basically starting to recognize the world again, fuel's on its way. That's the point to make. Fuel is on its way. The stations are going to be fully stocked before you know it, and just try to hang in there, and it's all going to be okay eventually.
And Matt, looking here specifically at Tampa, at the peak, we had, over 3/4 of stations without fuel. Thankfully, after peaking at almost 76% outages, we're down now to 47%. Even earlier today, it was, 54% this morning. So this is actively continuing to vastly improve. A lot of the big retail outlets out there now have fully covered regular gasoline. And if you're sitting at a pump, if your car takes premium, keep in mind, a lot of the time, the retailers, after a storm like this, they will focus first on regular gasoline because that's the biggest problem. Diesel generally is a problem, but a lesser of one. And then after that, they'll start concentrating on figuring out the premium. So if you're sitting at a gas pump and it says no premium, just give it a couple of days, because regular gasoline is kind of the first thing that stations tend to improve, then diesel, then premium. So we're not out of the woods yet, but the numbers are looking fairly good.
Yeah. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. I know how busy you are. I know how busy everyone there is, all the first responders. We thank all of you for everything that you all have done throughout the last few weeks, because you all have definitely earned some PTO, if you will, a vacation, and then some. Maybe you can take a cruise soon.
Oh my gosh, I would love that. I know exactly where to go if I need to. I do want to just say before I go, thank you to you both for helping to educate our community, because as you mentioned, Matt, we're part of the community. So our port, I want to give a huge thank you and gratitude to our push teams, which are the people who work for the port and are the first to respond. Many of them have been working every single day throughout both storms without a single day off. And these are people who have maybe lost their homes, have also been dealing with power outages, lack of water, boil water notices, and they're working through it because they know that they have to serve the greater good. So I really want to thank everyone who's been an integral part of our emergency response. You mentioned first responders. We've had Florida Highway Patrol and local law enforcement help us escort these fuel tankers to where they're going so that there's no issue. And just all the coordination and help we've gotten from our local politicians all the way up to federal politicians has been great. And we just are so grateful that we're able to really serve our community the way we have.
And to that point, Matt, it's been great seeing, the pickup, even the use of our data by entities like FEMA trying to direct resources. I know a lot of folks don't like politicians, and I can't necessarily blame them, but to say that they were sitting around waiting is not true. They definitely were taking very hands-on approach with this. Politicians from both sides of the aisle, from FEMA, from Florida emergency response team, everyone is trying to improve the situation, and now we're starting to see those numbers. And to Lisa's point, there's a lot of folks out there that put in a tireless effort to make sure that you can have the gasoline that you need when you need it.
Yeah. First responders, essential services, hospitals, ports, all of those things, airports, everybody sacrifices a lot on that. So the next time that you happen to be waiting in line someplace, maybe at the airport, or say thanks, because they work really hard. And when it comes to a situation like this, they work extra hard, and they put their own personal needs off to the side to make sure that they take care of the community as a whole. Just make sure you show a little bit of gratitude and appreciation, because they sure are working awfully hard to help.
Well said.
Well, Miss Lisa, thank you so much for joining us. I really, really appreciate it. I know you have so much to do, and we wish you well, and let us know if there's anything that we can do to help you in the future, even in the coming days and weeks. We are happy to revisit and do anything that we can.
Thank you both. It was such a pleasure to meet both of you, and thank you for the opportunity to share our information with your public. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. You take care. And that is Lisa Wolf-Chasen. She is actually the spokesperson for the Port of Tampa. We thank her so much for joining us. And Patrick, over the next week or so, where do you see prices going before we wrap this up?
Well, Matt, I was going to give a quick update too for all those that are in Florida. Thankfully, Milton had no impact on what they're paying at the pump. In fact, Florida's average gas prices are down a penny. For the rest of us, Matt, it's been kind of a quiet period of time. The prices have been pretty steady, up a penny from yesterday, about steady from last week, up a penny from a month ago. We'll call that steady. The good news, Matt, is that oil prices, after skyrocketing because of Iran's attack on Israel, oil prices have come back down to earth. In fact, oil prices, as I check here at this moment, down about $1.50 a barrel today. We're back down to $74 a barrel after having risen to $78. So we may actually start to see gas prices fade once again. We'll leave it there. It's good news for Florida. Outages are decreasing and gas prices should start to trend lower.
All right. That's going to do it for this edition of Over a Barrel. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll talk again coming up really soon. This episode of Over a Barrel has been brought to you by When you make the call, Valero's there to answer with 24/7 U.S.-based customer support. Because we believe you should always have the fuel you need when you need it, right now.